In the parish ledger of Ash Hollow, Kentucky, there is a line written in fading ink that has unsettled every scholar who has read it. Dated January 14, 1851, it records the baptism of twin sons to Samuel and Ruth Calhoun. The Reverend's neat hand lists their names, their date of birth, and then, in the margin, a single cryptic sentence. They share a single fate. What followed was more than rumor. The boys spoke of deaths before they happened, drew disasters before they struck, and at last foretold their own ends with eerie precision. One in fire, the other in water. Their prophecy would come true exactly as they described. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell. We publish new accounts every week from the darker corners of history. And we'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Drop your city or state in the comments below. In the winter of 1851, the small parish of Ash Hollow, Kentucky, recorded the arrival of two children whose birth would become a matter of whispered fear for generations. Their entry appears in the leather-bound baptismal ledger of Reverend Josiah Bell, preserved today in the county archives. The handwriting is neat, the ink faded, but the line remains legible. January 14th, male twins born to Samuel and Ruth Calhoun, baptized at 3 days, both living, both marked. The marking was never clarified in the official entry, but in the margins of the same page, Bell scrawled an unsettling note rarely found in the otherwise orderly record. They share a single fate. Scholars who examined the ledger decades later noted the unusual addition, pointing out that Bell, a cautious and precise clergyman, almost never wrote personal comments beside baptisms. The word suggested that something about the birth unsettled him enough to abandon his clerical detachment. The twins were not delivered in town, but in a drafty farmhouse at the edge of the hollow, where the Calhoun family had lived for 3 generations. The attending midwife, Sarah Pickens, left behind her own brief account. In a letter to her niece, preserved among family papers, she described the event. They came silent into the world. Both opened their eyes before they made a sound, and each looked directly to the other. It was as if they waited for the other's breath before taking their own. Neighbors recalled the strange quiet of the house in the days that followed. Instead of the usual wailing of infants, visitors found the boys lying side by side in a cradle fashioned from a hollowed oak. They seldom cried. When one stirred, the other did the same. When one fed, the other ceased. The mother, Ruth, confided to a neighbor that she often woke in the night to find both children staring at one another in perfect silence, their small chests rising and falling in unison. From the beginning, townsfolk remarked that the boys seemed less like two individuals than two halves of the same being. The Calhouns, an otherwise ordinary family of farmers, became the subject of quiet speculation. Some said the twins were a blessing, a doubling of fortune for a household with modest means. Others whispered they were an omen, that no good could come from children who mirrored each other so completely. The Reverend's unease only deepened as the baptism approached. In his sermon notes for that Sunday, still preserved in the church vestry, he wrote, "Some souls enter the world marked by providence, others, I fear, by something darker. These two I cannot yet discern." His words never made it into the sermon itself, but they reflect a private dread that grew even before the twins could walk or speak. By the time the parish bell tolled over their baptismal ceremony, the story of their uncanny birth had already begun to spread through Ash Hollow. Farmwives shook their heads and said it was unnatural for babies to watch each other so intently. Children dared each other to peek through the Calhoun windows at night, swearing they saw the brothers' eyes glowing faintly in the dark. What began as a simple record in a parish ledger would, in time, grow into one of Kentucky's most disturbing legends. The line, "They share a single fate," would prove more than idle speculation. It would become prophecy. As the twins grew past infancy, their strangeness only deepened. Town records describe them as physically healthy, tall for their age, broad-shouldered, with the same flaxen hair and pale eyes. Yet every account emphasizes what they lacked: the ordinary noises of childhood. By the age of 3, neither had uttered more than a handful of words. When addressed, they often did not answer at all, or else gave identical replies at the same time, as though rehearsed. Neighbors later testified that the boys seemed to converse with glances, tilting their heads in silence until one would suddenly laugh and the other would join him, though no words had been spoken aloud. The Calhoun farmhouse became a place of fascination and dread. Local women whispered of visiting Ruth and finding both boys seated on the floor, their small hands folded, staring at one another in perfect stillness. Minutes could pass without a movement. Then, with no signal anyone else could detect, they would both turn their heads toward the door at once, anticipating a knock, a visitor, or the arrival of their father returning from the fields. One neighbor, Mrs. Eliza Carr, left a description in her diary that survives today. "I brought milk over one afternoon and found the two children sitting beneath the window. They did not look at me, only at each other. When I asked if they wanted bread, one smiled and the other shook his head, as if they had decided beforehand who would answer. It set my teeth on edge." School was no different. At the small one-room schoolhouse in Ash Hollow, the twins occupied the back bench. The teacher, Jonathan Briggs, complained in notes preserved among his papers. "They do not recite when called upon. They whisper to each other without moving their lips. When one writes figures, the other copies the same mistake without glancing at his slate. I fear they cannot be taught as other boys are." Other pupils avoided them. A story circulated that when one boy mocked them, calling them ghost children, both twins turned their gaze upon him and whispered in unison. The following week, he fell ill with fever and missed the rest of the term. Though coincidence explained it well enough, the children began to fear the brothers, claiming that any insult might bring misfortune. By 7, their silences were punctuated by sudden bursts of laughter that unsettled even their parents. Samuel Calhoun, a farmer hardened by seasons of toil, confessed once to a neighbor after too much whiskey, "It is like they live in two worlds, one with us and one only they can see, and I fear the one we cannot." Ruth, by contrast, defended her sons fiercely. She claimed they were gifted, that God had joined them in a way others could not understand. But even she admitted that on nights when storms rattled the shutters, she sometimes found them awake in bed, holding hands across the space between their cots, whispering words she could not hear. Their silence made them the subject of endless speculation. Some said they were simple-minded. Others claimed they were touched by second sight. The Reverend Bell, who had marked their baptism with unease, began to avoid their family pew altogether. In his private journal, one line remains, dated June of 1858. "The boys grow, yet speak not as other children. When they look upon one another, it is as if the rest of us do not exist. The mark of fate darkens." For the town of Ash Hollow, the twins had become an unanswered question. Were they blessed? Were they cursed? Or were they simply shadows of one another, bound so closely that the outside world would never truly touch them? The years of silence laid the foundation for what would follow. It was in this quiet, unnatural, uncanny, that the first true omen of death would emerge. In the autumn of 1858, when the twins were 7 years old, Ash Hollow witnessed the first account that would set their reputation in stone. It came not through rumor alone, but through testimony recorded in both a coroner's inquest and the private diary of their schoolmaster. The event began as an idle whisper between the brothers. According to their cousin, who was visiting the Calhoun farmhouse, she overheard one boy lean toward the other and murmur, "The river will take him, he won't come back." When asked later who him referred to, the brothers only exchanged glances and said nothing. Within a week, the body of John Mercer, a farmer in his 40s, was pulled from the swollen creek after a late harvest storm. He had been driving cattle across the ford when the rain swelled the water beyond safe passage. Witnesses said his wagon overturned and dragged him under. The coroner's ledger for Mercer's death, preserved in the county courthouse, contains a curious addition. At the bottom of the page, in a different hand than the official report, someone had scribbled, "The Calhoun twins said this would come." Scholars believe the note was written by a juror, perhaps to remind himself of the strange rumor already circulating through town. The schoolmaster, Jonathan Briggs, confirmed the story in his journal. In an entry dated October 22, 1858, he wrote, "Before the body was recovered, the boys drew tours on their slates. One showed a wagon in water, a man beneath the wheels. Both laughed together, as if it were a jest. I chastised them for cruelty, but they would not erase the image. When Mercer's death was announced, the likeness was too exact to dismiss." Word spread quickly. By the end of the month, farmers were crossing themselves when the twins passed by. Mothers pulled their children closer. At the general store, men muttered that it was unnatural for boys to speak of drowning before a drowning occurred. The Reverend Bell, whose discomfort with the twins had been noted since their baptism, addressed the matter obliquely in a sermon. His notes read, "Children may serve as instruments, knowingly or not. When the tongue utters death before death arrives, what spirit gives it voice?" For the Calhoun family, the incident marked a turning point. Samuel insisted it was coincidence, that children repeat what they hear from adults. Ruth clung to the notion that her sons had a special sensitivity, perhaps even a gift. But their neighbors were less forgiving. In the hollow, whispers hardened into fear. The boys were not merely odd, they were dangerous. From that day forward, whenever a misfortune befell the town, a barn fire, a fever, a broken limb, people asked in hushed voices, did the twins know of this too? It was the first time the brothers' silent bond seemed to reach beyond themselves, touching the lives and deaths of others. The prediction of Mercer's drowning would not be their last. It was only the beginning. By the spring of 1860, the twins were 9 years old and still attending the one-room schoolhouse that served the scattered families of Ash Hollow. Their presence unsettled the other pupils, but their parents insisted they be educated alongside the community's children. What happened that year ensured they would never again be regarded as ordinary boys. In April, teacher Jonathan Briggs recorded in his attendance book that both twins had appeared unusually restless, refusing to recite lessons and instead covering their slates with drawings. Unlike the usual arithmetic problems or copied lines of scripture, each slate bore the same crude sketch, a roof collapsing, with stick figures fleeing beneath it. Briggs confiscated the slates, assuming the boys were making mischief, but when he attempted to discipline them, they only smiled and exchanged their familiar wordless glance. Within weeks, a violent storm struck the hollow. Lightning split a tree beside the schoolhouse, sending the heavy trunk crashing against the roof. The timbers gave way, and part of the ceiling collapsed during a Sunday gathering. By providence, no children were present, but the incident left the building unsafe for months. The coincidence did not pass unnoticed. Briggs, shaken, added a note in the margin of his ledger. The twins foresaw the roof's fall. I dismissed it as mischief, but their drawings were plain. I fear we are dealing with something I cannot explain. His annotated attendance book still survives in the county archive, with faint pencil marks of the children's names beside the damaged page. Parents of other pupils were less charitable. Within days of the collapse, rumors spread that the boys had invited the disaster, or worse, summoned it. Several mothers withdrew their children from the schoolhouse, refusing to allow them to sit beside the cursed ones. A petition reached the parish council that summer, calling for the Calhoun twins to be removed from instruction altogether. One signature preserved on the document includes a chilling justification. They foretell ruin. If they remain among ours, who can say what fate will follow? The Calhoun folktale. Miley resisted, but their standing in the community began to falter. Samuel grew increasingly defensive, quarreling with neighbors who whispered that his sons carried ill omen. Ruth, in desperation, appealed to the Reverend Bell to intervene, but Bell refused to speak on their behalf. In a sermon delivered shortly after the storm, he told his congregation, "Some children bring joy, others bring sorrow. We must discern which is which for the safety of all." Though the twins themselves remained silent, their drawings lingered in the memories of those who had seen them. Crude lines on slate had become a prophecy fulfilled. From that day, few in Ash Hollow doubted that the Calhoun brothers possessed a sight that reached beyond ordinary children, a sight tied inexorably to death and ruin. By the summer of 1861, the unease surrounding the Calhoun twins had grown too heavy to ignore. At 10 years old, they were strong and healthy, yet still spoke little, their private communication baffling to teachers and neighbors alike. Their parents, weary of whispers that the boys were cursed, sought to prove once and for all that their sons were merely unusual, not unnatural. They called upon Dr. Nathaniel Harlan, a respected physician who served the Hollow and surrounding counties. Harlan's medical ledger, preserved in the Kentucky Historical Society, contains a curious entry under July of that year. Examined the Calhoun twins. Healthy appearance. Pulse irregular in manner most unusual. What the doctor discovered disturbed him deeply. When he placed his stethoscope against the chest of the first boy, he noted a steady heartbeat. Moving to the second, he found the rhythm identical, so identical in fact, that he began to suspect his instrument was malfunctioning. But after repeating the test several times, even counting aloud as their parents watched, the conclusion was inescapable. Tucked. His brother's pulses rose and fell in perfect unison. The physician recorded further. Tested under exertion. Had one run, the other ceded, yet both heartbeats quickened together. When one ceased activity, both calmed, a phenomenon beyond my knowledge. According to later testimony, Harlan attempted an experiment that unsettled even the parents. He pinched one boy's forearm with force enough to raise a welt. The child winced, yet it was the brother who cried out, clutching his own arm, though untouched. The doctor wrote only a single line about the matter, perhaps reluctant to be thought fanciful. They share sensations not accounted for by science. Local rumor, however, was less restrained. Within days, townsfolk were repeating that the twins felt each other's pain, and that if one were to fall ill, the other would die. Children began to avoid them entirely, convinced that touching either brother might bring sickness. The Reverend Bell, already uneasy with the family, recorded in his private journal, "Their bodies seem bound as their souls. What God has joined so tightly, man should not seek to sever. Yet I fear it will not end in peace." The examination that was meant to quiet suspicion had the opposite effect. Instead of reassurance, it confirmed for many that the twins were joined by something unnatural. Samuel and Ruth withdrew further from community life, keeping their sons close to the farmhouse. But isolation only deepened the mystery. In Ash Hollow, a whisper hardened into certainty. If the boys shared one heartbeat, they must also share one destiny. And in the minds of neighbors, destiny meant death. By 1863, the Calhoun twins were 12 years old. Their silence had become familiar in Ash Hollow, but it was the content of their speech, when they chose to use it, that disturbed neighbors most. For the first time, their words carried visions of death. The earliest account comes from a farmhand, Matthew Corbett, who boarded with the Calhouns that year. In a statement, recorded decades later in an interview for the Louisville Courier, Corbett recalled waking in the night to the sound of the brothers whispering. Peering into their shared room, he saw one boy seated upright, eyes wide, recounting a dream. "I saw flames. Roof fell. People ran. One did not come out. The other boy listened intently, nodding before answering. And I saw water. Dark water. The man went down. He did not rise." Within weeks, a barn fire claimed the life of a neighbor, and a ferryman drowned when his skiff overturned at the river crossing. Both events, ordinary tragedies for the time, might have been dismissed as coincidence, if not for the whispers that the boys had spoken of them first. The teacher, Jonathan Briggs, who continued to keep sparse notes on the twins despite their infrequent attendance, recorded in his diary that the brothers began sketching their dreams during lessons. One page, preserved among his belongings, shows crude figures engulfed in what appear to be waves, another standing beneath jagged lines suggesting lightning. Briggs wrote, "Their drawings disturb the others. They seem less like childish fancy and more like remembrance of things not yet come." Parents became wary. If a child fell ill or suffered a fall, neighbors asked in hushed tones whether the twins had seen it in their sleep. Some avoided the Calhoun farm entirely, believing that to be mentioned in one of their dreams was to be marked for misfortune. The Reverend Bell, by now aged and ailing, delivered one of his last sermons that autumn. Notes from his Bible margins read, "Beware those who speak of death before its time. The dreams of children should be of play, not graves." Though he never named them, the congregation knew who he meant. For the Calhoun family, life grew increasingly isolated. Ruth forbade the boys from sharing their dreams outside the household, but their silence could not erase the suspicion. Samuel, worn down by neighbors' stares, admitted to a cousin that he feared his sons saw things meant to stay hidden. From that year forward, the brothers' dreams became part of the folklore of Ash Hollow. Death followed their visions often enough to convince the townsfolk that the twins carried knowledge not of this world. Each tragedy seemed to confirm it. The boys were no longer just strange children. They were, in the eyes of their neighbors, the unwilling heralds of death. In the summer of 1865, when the Calhoun twins were 14, their strange visions turned upon themselves. Until then, their dreams had foretold the misfortunes of others, neighbors, farmers, strangers passing through Ash Hollow. But according to family testimony, the brothers began speaking openly of their own deaths, as though they had already seen the manner of their fates. The account comes from their cousin, Martha Calhoun, who visited the farmhouse that year. In her diary, preserved in a trunk found in Tennessee, she wrote of an evening spent in their company. The boys sat across from one another in silence, as is their way. Suddenly, one spoke, saying, "You will drown. I see the river close over you, and no hand will pull you out." The other did not argue, only nodded, and answered in turn, "And you will burn. Fire will take you, and there will be nothing left but smoke." They both smiled as if in agreement and then returned to silence. The detail chilled her. Martha added in the margin, "They spoke it without fear, like men describing a chore to be done. Never have I heard children speak so plainly of their own end." Other family members confirmed similar conversations. An uncle recalled the twins describing their deaths during supper, each repeating the other's "wutinoto" RDs until their parents forced them into silence. Neighbors, too, began to whisper that the boys were marked, not only by what they saw, but by what they accepted. By then, the townsfolk of Ash Hollow were convinced the Calhoun brothers were cursed. The barn fire and the drowning had made their earlier dreams impossible to dismiss. To hear that the boys now foresaw their own deaths seemed proof that the curse would one day destroy them, just as it had haunted those around them. Even Reverend Bell, near death himself and too frail to preach regularly, made a final note in his journal. They speak calmly of their own demise. What children embrace such fate unless fate itself has already claimed them? The prophecy spread quickly. By winter, the story was told in hushed voices at taverns and around kitchen hearths. One twin destined to burn, the other to drown. Some claim to have seen the boys act out the scenes in their games, one lying still on the floor with arms outstretched as if consumed by flames, the other holding his breath until his face turned blue. To the Calhoun parents, it was a torment. Ruth prayed that their words were no more than childish fantasy. Samuel raged at the suggestion that his sons carried death inside them, but neither could shake the feeling that their boys were speaking truth. From this point onward, the legend of the Calhoun twins shifted. They were no longer merely harbingers of others' deaths. They had written their own ending, years before it would come. And in Ash Hollow, people began to watch the river and the barns with uneasy anticipation, waiting to see which vision would be fulfilled first. By 1867, the twins had reached 16. Their strange reputation had hardened into fear, and the parish council decided something must be done. If the boys shared one fate, then perhaps dividing them might weaken whatever bound them together. The decision is preserved in a surviving parish record, a yellowed page bearing the signatures of 6 council members. Their resolution read, "For the good of the hollow, the brothers shall be parted, one to remain with his parents, the other to dwell with kin in the neighboring county, until such time as their speech and conduct show signs of improvement." In April, one brother was sent to live with an uncle across the county line. The journey was short, a half-day by wagon, but the effect was immediate. Within hours of their parting, both boys collapsed into fever. According to testimony from the family Bible, they shivered and sweated as though struck by ague. The twin left behind in Ash Hollow was found pale and gasping in his bed, while the one in his uncle's house grew too weak to stand. Dr. Nathaniel Harlan, the same physician who had examined them years before, was called again. His notes survive in his medical ledger. Symptoms mirror each other. Separated, they decline together. Neither improves until brought again within sight of the other. After 4 days of sickness, the parish reluctantly abandoned its experiment. The boy was returned home, and by nightfall both were walking, color restored. The incident spread swiftly through the hollow. Neighbors whispered that the boys could not be divided without bringing death upon themselves. Some claimed it was proof that they shared one soul between 2 bodies. Others said it showed the devil's mark, that what God had joined, man had no power to sever. One witness, a farm wife named Lydia Parker, wrote to her sister in Indiana. It was a dreadful sight. They lay in their beds miles apart, yet suffered the same fever at the same hour. When brought together, they opened their eyes and looked to each other before strength returned. It was not natural. From that spring onward, no one suggested separation again. The parish council quietly struck the resolution from its minutes, leaving only the faded signature page as evidence it had ever been attempted. For the Calhoun twins, the failed experiment confirmed what the townsfolk already suspected. Their lives were bound together in ways beyond understanding. And for Ash Hollow, it deepened the conviction that whatever fate awaited one boy, the other would surely share it. By the winter of 1868, the unease surrounding the Calhoun twins had grown into open hostility. Neighbors no longer whispered in kitchens and taverns. They carried their fears to the county courthouse. What had begun as gossip and rumor now became ink on paper, preserved in petitions and testimony that remain in the archives of Hart County. The first petition, dated December 3, 1868, bore the signatures of 23 residents of Ash Hollow. Its language was stark. "We believe the presence of Samuel and Ruth Calhoun's twin sons brings misfortune upon this community. Their dreams of death precede deaths. Their drawings precede calamities. We request removal or confinement for the safety of all." Attached to the petition were sworn statements. One came from the miller, Thomas Ward, who recounted how the boys had stood silently by the riverbank days before a worker drowned in its current. "They spoke no word," Ward wrote. "Yet when the body was pulled from the water, one boy said, 'We saw it already.'" Another statement came from Mary Fletcher, whose daughter had fallen ill with fever. She swore that the twins had passed by her gate the week before, whispering together and laughing. "Since that day," Fletcher claimed, "my child has not risen from her bed. I believe them cursed." The court clerk, clearly uneasy, included a note in the margin of the record. "These charges are of a superstitious nature and not supported by law, yet the number of petitioners compels acknowledgement." The magistrate, reluctant to act against minors without cause, dismissed the request formally. The paper trail remained, and with it, a chilling glimpse of how deep the fear had spread. At home, the Calhouns felt the weight of the accusations. Samuel grew defiant, refusing to move his family despite offers from relatives in other towns. Ruth wept often, torn between defending her sons and fearing what they might truly be. Neighbors ceased trading with the family altogether. Grain went unsold. Livestock fetched lower prices. Isolation pressed upon them from every side. The twins themselves seemed untouched by the storm. They continued to keep to one another, whispering in the strange language no one else could hear. If they knew the town was petitioning for their removal, they gave no sign. But in Ash Hollow, the matter was settled in the minds of many. The boys were not simply unusual, they were a danger. And if the law would not act, then fate, or something darker, surely would. In the summer of 1870, the prophecy the twins had spoken years earlier began to take form. By then, they were 19, lean and quiet young men who rarely left the Calhoun farm. Their reputation had not softened with age. Neighbors avoided them in the marketplace, and even the parish records for that year show their pew listed as vacant by request of others. It was in July that the fire came. On a stormless night, the barn at the Calhoun property caught flame. Witnesses described seeing the glow against the sky before the church bell rang an alarm. Neighbors rushed to help, but by the time they arrived, the roof was already collapsing. Inside, one of the twins, whose name the records never distinguish clearly, had been attempting to save the livestock. According to testimony gathered by the county coroner, the young man was seen at the loft window, framed by smoke, before the timbers gave way. His cries carried across the hollow. But at that same hour, his brother, who had been in the farmhouse half a mile away, collapsed on the floor, gasping, screaming words no one else could see. A cousin later testified. He shouted, "I am burning. My skin is burning." Yet no flame touched him. By dawn, the barn lay in ruins. When the embers cooled, the remains of one twin were found among the collapsed beams. The official cause of death listed in the county register: perished in accidental fire. But beside that entry, a clerk added a single, unsettling line: brother bore the burns, though unscathed by flame. The surviving twin bore no visible injuries, yet his skin blistered in patches across his arms and chest. Dr. Nathaniel Harlan, who had examined the boys years earlier, wrote in his medical journal, "Symptoms consistent with fire burns, yet patient never entered the blaze. I cannot account for it." The record survives, though the page is stained with smoke, as if the book itself had once been too close to fire. For Ash Hollow, the tragedy confirmed what had long been whispered. The boys' fates were bound. One had spoken of burning, and so it had come to pass. The other, left behind, seemed to carry the pain of his brother's death in body as well as in spirit. In the taverns and the churchyard, people spoke more freely now. Some said the surviving twin was living on borrowed time. Others swore he would follow soon, for no bond like theirs could be broken without death claiming both halves. And in the hollow silence of the farmhouse, Ruth Calhoun mourned one son while watching the other waste away. For though he walked among the living, neighbors swore he already carried the look of the dead. The fire had taken one brother, and with him half the life of the other. By the autumn of 1870, the surviving twin was a hollow figure. Neighbors described him as pale, gaunt, and distant, spending long hours by the riverbank where the water moved slow and dark beneath the willow trees. The Calhoun farmhouse, once whispered about, became almost entirely deserted. Samuel kept to his fields. Ruth rarely left the house at all. Visitors recalled the silence inside, broken only by the sound of the last twin murmuring to himself, as though answering a voice no one else could hear. On the morning of October 12th, a group of boys walking to school saw him standing knee-deep in the river, his eyes fixed on the water. One later testified at the coroner's inquest. "He did not look at us," he said. "I hear him calling." Then he walked further in, as if stepping through a doorway. The boys ran for help, but by the time neighbors arrived, only ripples marked the place where he had vanished. They searched the shallows, dragged the deeper pools, and sent word downriver. No body was ever recovered. What was recovered, however, were the accounts of what people swore they heard. Several witnesses insisted that as the twin disappeared beneath the surface, two voices cried out, not one. A farmer's wife, Mary Fletcher, told the inquest, "It was as though both brothers were speaking from under the water. One voice cried, 'Fire,' the other, 'River.'" The official register lists the cause of death as presumed drowning, body unrecovered. But beside the entry, the coroner added a line that generations of researchers have puzzled over. Two cries heard, though one alone was present. The prophecy had come full circle. One twin taken by fire, the other by water. Their words, spoken years before in the farmhouse parlor, fulfilled without deviation. In Ash Hollow, the legend hardened into permanence. Parents warned their children not to linger by barns or rivers, whispering that the twins still wandered there. The Calhoun name, once respectable, became a curse. Samuel and Ruth, broken by grief, left the hollow within a year. The farm was abandoned, its barn a charred skeleton, its fields untended, and the river kept its silence. Some said it never gave up Tate. He boy's body because it had claimed not one life, but two. The burial of the Calhoun twins remains one of the most unusual entries in the parish records of Ash Hollow. Though only one body was ever recovered, the remains pulled from the ruins of the barn fire, the church ledger recorded two names side by side. On December 2nd, 1870, Reverend Josiah Bell's successor, Reverend Amos Crane, wrote the entry in the baptismal and burial register. The handwriting is deliberate, almost ceremonial. Interred, Thomas and Elias Calhoun, twin sons of Samuel and Ruth, laid together in rest. Beneath it, in the margin, Crane added a cryptic note, "Two boys, one fate." The funeral itself was sparsely attended. The barn fire had already soured the town's sympathy, and the drowning, with its unanswered questions, deepened suspicion rather than sorrow. Witnesses recalled only a handful of neighbors standing at a distance, their heads bowed more from fear than mourning. The coffin lowered into the earth contained only the scorched remains of the first brother. For the second, no body was ever found. Yet the family insisted the twins be buried as one. A single coffin, a single grave, marked by a modest wooden cross bearing both names. The decision unsettled many. One parishioner later remarked, "It felt wrong to bury the living with the dead, yet who could say he was not already gone? If his body never rose, then perhaps his soul never left." In the years that followed, the grave became the subject of whispered tales. Some claimed they heard two voices when passing it at night, faint as the rustle of leaves. Others swore the ground never settled properly, as if disturbed from within. Children dared each other to place stones upon the grave, but by morning the stones were always scattered as though brushed aside. For the Calhoun parents, the burial marked the end of their life in Ash Hollow. Samuel sold what little remained of his farm, Ruth refusing even to look back at the fields where her sons had once played. They departed quietly, their wagon rolling out before dawn. Where they went, no record survives, but the grave remained, a place where one body rested, the other absent, a coffin filled with ash and bone, yet inscribed for two. And in the parish ledger, still preserved in brittle ink, the words endure, "Two boys, one fate." Decades after the deaths of the Calhoun twins, new evidence surfaced that reignited the old fear. In 1894, while clearing an attic trunk in Tennessee, descendants of the Calhoun family discovered a small, leather-bound diary. Its owner was identified by inscription. This book belongs to Martha Calhoun, Ash Hollow, 1865. Martha had been their cousin, the same who once recorded the prophecy the boys spoke to each other, one by fire, the other by water. Her diary confirmed not only her earlier testimony, but revealed drawings and notes that had never before been known to the public. On brittle pages, preserved now in the Kentucky Historical Society, are crude sketches in pencil. One depicts a figure engulfed in jagged lines of flame, another beneath heavy waves. Several smaller drawings show stick figures with X's over their eyes beside barns, rivers, and even the schoolhouse roof. Each is annotated in Martha's careful hand. The boys drew these in 1863, said they were not dreams, but things they had seen already. One passage from the diary is especially chilling. They told me they could see death before it came. They said the air changed when someone's end was near, like smoke before fire. They laughed when I begged them to stop, saying they only spoke what they knew. I fear they did not guess, but knew. The discovery of the diary drew the attention of local newspapers. The Louisville Courier-Journal ran a brief article in February 1895 under the headline, Prophecies of the Ash Hollow Twins. The piece summarized the family legend, but added the new detail of Martha's sketches, noting that several corresponded precisely to tragedies recorded in county registers. The diary's appearance gave fresh weight to the legend. For a new generation who had not witnessed the boys themselves, the drawings provided tangible proof. Scholars debated whether Martha's notes were exaggerations, but the correspondence between her entries and known events, Mercer's drowning, the schoolhouse collapse, the barn fire, was difficult to dismiss. In Ash Hollow, the grave of the twins became a place of uneasy pilgrimage once more. Farmers swore the ground grew weeds more stubborn than any other plot. Children told the story of the diary, dared each other to whisper their own deaths at the sight, believing the twins might answer back. Through Martha's diary, the past returned to life. The twins were no longer confined to fading memory or parish record. Their voices, faint but insistent, spoke again from the pages, and with them came the same question that had haunted Ash Hollow for half a century. Did they see death or summon it? In the years after the Calhoun family left, their story loosened from record and fixed itself in memory. What could once be traced through ledgers and petitions became warnings told at kitchen tables and along fence lines. The facts did not change so much as they acquired instructions. By the 1880s, travelers' guides noted Ash Hollow as an ill-omened bend, where barns burned easily and the river turned cold without season. The county almanac for 1887 carries a penciled note in a margin beside the fire weather chart. Keep lanterns trimmed low in July. Do not speak of drowning come October. The handwriting is un-Cree. Dated, the habit persisted. Children were taught small rituals. Do not run past the old Calhoun Lane after sundown. Do not look directly at the river on the 12th of October. If you must cross the water, cross where you cannot see your reflection. Mothers told their sons to count to 2 before entering a barn with a lantern. Once for caution, once for the twins. Few admitted they believed such things. Fewer ignored them. A school composition book from 1891, preserved among district papers, includes an essay titled, Our Town's Story. The student writes, 2 boys knew how folks would die and spoke it. My father says to keep quiet near the grave, because they hear even whispers. The teacher underlined keep quiet and left the grade blank. Hunters claimed that on dry summer nights the charred ribs of the Calhoun barn creaked like cooling timber, though nothing had stood there for years. Mill workers swore the river slowed at the bend below the willow, then sped again as if passing a narrow door. A farmhand told his employer that he heard counting in the cane at dusk. 1, then 2, and no more. In 1894, after Martha Calhoun's diary surfaced, the tale settled into its most durable form. People repeated the sequence as if reciting a catechism. 2 boys, 1 birth entry marked, they share a single fate. Drawings before disasters, the failed separation and the fever. Fire in July, the river in October, the single coffin with 2 names. When a field hand slipped under a toppled hayrack, someone always said the twins would have seen it. When a stovepipe flared too bright in a loft, somebody else blew the flame down and crossed himself without comment. The Federal Writers Project sent an interviewer through Hart County in 1938. In his notes, typed and carbon copied, he logged a visit with an elderly woman who had been a girl when the barn burned. She would not give her name. They were good boys, she said, but they were listening where we could not. The town feared them because they were Nevet. Her surprised. Asked whether the voices at the river were real, she folded her hands. You don't have to believe a thing for it to listen back. The grave drew its own calendar. Some placed 2 pebbles on the wooden cross and returned later to find only 1, as if the earth accepted one offering and rejected the other. Others left their names written on scrap paper as a test. By morning, the scraps were wet and blurred, unreadable, even in clear weather. The caretaker eventually posted a plain notice. No night visits. It did little. By the turn of the century, the Calhoun place appeared on county maps as Calhoun Tract, Abundianso. The mark did not keep people away. Couples went there to prove they were not afraid. Boys dared one another to shout a date and a manner of death into the wind. The braver ones tried to speak for a friend. Most left quickly, without pride. The story's last instruction was the simplest. Do not say aloud how you will die. In Ash Hollow, that was considered an invitation. The twins had taught the town to keep a certain kind of silence. On storm nights, when the river lifts its voice and the willow leans toward the water, some claim the bend answers with two sounds at once, the hiss of rain like fire on timber, and the low pull of current over stone. Those who hear it do not linger. They say the hollow still counts to two, and then it waits. By the turn of the 20th century, the Calhoun twins had passed fully from life into legend. Their grave remained, but their names existed more often in whispered stories than in any formal history. The courthouse petitions, the doctor's ledger, the cousin's diary, all were scattered in archives, consulted occasionally by scholars who found themselves less certain with every page they read. The last official note lies in the parish register of Ash Hollow. On a page dated 1901, the new minister, Reverend Samuel Price, recorded a simple annotation beside the earlier burial entry. No further service required. Both accounted. The words close the book, but not the questions. Researchers who revisit the case find themselves divided. Some argue that the boys were no more than victims of superstition, their strangeness magnified by isolation and fear. Others suggest an early instance of shared delusion, or a condition not yet understood by medicine, twin telepathy stretched into tragedy. Yet a third group admits the evidence points to something more difficult to explain, that their predictions were too precise, their fates too perfectly fulfilled to be dismissed as chance. In Ash Hollow, the debate matters little. There, the twins are remembered not through scholarship, but through silence. Farmers still cross themselves when the willow leans heavy over the river. Children still dare each other to whisper their deaths, though most stop at the first word. The grave, marked now only by a weathered stone, still carries both names. The earth below it still holds only one body. To this day, the parish ledger preserves the margin note made at their baptism. They share a single fate. It was written before their first words, before their first dream, before the barn or the river claimed them. What began as a cryptic aside became prophecy. The Calhoun twins left no descendants, no possessions, no legacy beyond the fear they inspired. Their story survives in records, in rumors, and in the quiet that lingers around their grave. And in that silence lies the only conclusion history can offer. Two boys, bound from birth, who knew not only how others would die, but how they themselves would end, fire for one, water for the other. The ledger closes with their names. The questions remain.